The moment I stepped into the Grand Lancaster estate, a suffocating weight pressed against my chest. The air smelled of polished wood, expensive perfume, and something colder, resentment. It wasn't just the heavy silence of the guests watching me, nor the judgmental stares from my family that made my skin crawl. It was the knowledge that I had done this before. In another life I had walked this very path. But in that lifetime I had been nothing more than a pawn. Used, discarded, and left to rot in the shadows of those who held the real power. Not this time. Keep your head down, Celeste, my mother whispered harshly into my ear, her grip tightening on my arm as she led me forward. This is already humiliating enough. At least try to act grateful. Grateful? For being forced into the marriage my sister had so desperately escaped from? For being tossed aside like an unwanted rag doll, only useful when there was no other option left? I clenched my jaw but said nothing. What was the point? My mother had never seen me as anything more than Veronica's replacement. Backup plan. I was only standing here because my sister, the beloved perfect Veronica, had thrown a fit, cried, screamed, and ultimately convinced our parents that marrying Victor Lancaster was beneath her. I could still hear her words, hissed in outrage when she found out the marriage contract couldn't be broken. You expect me to marry that cripple? That had been enough for my parents to turn their attention to me. I had been living in the countryside, quietly minding my own business, thinking I was safe from the family's manipulations. But the moment Veronica refused, I was dragged back. My protests, my arguments, my struggles meant nothing. Now here I was, the unwanted bride. I kept my gaze forward as I was led to the ceremonial altar, where Victor Lancaster sat in his wheelchair waiting for me. The first time I had seen him in my past life I had pitied him. He had looked fragile then, just as he did now. Pale skin stretched over sharp cheekbones, dark hair neatly combed but unable to hide the weariness in his expression. His suit was tailored to perfection, giving him the appearance of power and control, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed him. He wasn't looking at me like a groom watching his bride. He wasn't even looking at me like a stranger. He was looking at me like an inconvenience. I didn't blame him. He had wanted my sister. He had been promised Veronica, the beautiful and perfect Montgomery daughter. Instead he got me. His grip tightened slightly on the arms of his wheelchair, his lips pressing into a thin line. If I hadn't been watching closely, I would have missed the way his fingers curled ever so slightly, like he was holding something back. Annoyance? Frustration? Or was it recognition? I forced myself to breathe. Oh, it couldn't be. He wasn't supposed to remember. Do you, Celeste Montgomery, take Victor Lancaster to be your lawfully wedded husband? I swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth. My past life flashed before me. The suffering, the betrayal, the nightmarish ending that had awaited both of us. I had no control back then. But this time, I did. I lifted my chin, straightened my shoulders, and met Victor's cold gaze. The room was silent, filled with the expectations of people waiting to see me falter. I would not. Yes. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I had answered too smoothly, too surely. They had expected hesitation, tears, regret. I gave them none. Victor's gaze darkened slightly, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair once again. He was studying me now, analyzing. I could almost hear his thoughts. Strange. This isn't the reaction I expected. Victor Lancaster, the officiant turned to him. Do you take Celeste Montgomery to be your lawfully wedded wife? For a moment Victor remained silent. The room tensed. Then, in a voice so smooth and emotionless it sent chills down my spine, he replied, I do. The words should have brought me relief. Instead they felt like chains locking around my wrist. The officiant smiled, oblivious to the invisible battle between us. You may now exchange rings. A servant stepped forward with the small velvet-lined box, holding our wedding bands. Victor didn't move. He didn't even glance at the rings. Instead, his gaze remained locked onto mine as if daring me to make the first move. So I did. With steady hands I picked up his ring, slid it onto his finger and held it there just a second too long, long enough for the message to be clear. You may not want this, but neither do I. That doesn't mean I will break first. Something flickered in his eyes. A challenge. A warning. He took the other ring and, with practiced precision, slid it onto my finger. His touch was cool, his movements careful and measured. But there was something else beneath it. An awareness, a silent understanding. We had just made a deal whether we wanted to or not. A deal to endure. To play this game. And maybe, just maybe, to see who would break first. The officiant smiled brightly. You may now kiss the bride. Victor's expression didn't change. Neither did mine. There was no need for discussion. He didn't move and I didn't expect him to. Instead, I took a small step forward, just enough to make it seem like I was closing the distance, then tilted my head slightly. A breath. That was all. A mockery of intimacy, close enough to satisfy the guests but far enough that neither of us had to endure actual contact. The crowd clapped, some relieved, some disappointed, some amused. I could already hear the whispers. She didn't flinch. Is she really okay with this? Poor girl, she doesn't know what she's gotten into. I knew exactly what I had gotten into. Victor Lancaster was not weak. He was not helpless. And neither was I. As the ceremony concluded, the guests swarming with fake pleasantries, I caught a final glimpse of my sister, standing in the far back of the room. Veronica. She was watching. And for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. She looked afraid. A slow smile curled at the edges of my lips. Good. Let her be afraid. Because this time the story was mine to rewrite. The carriage ride to our new home was silent. Victor sat across from me, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of his wheelchair, his gaze fixed out the window as if I wasn't even there. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, not the kind that came from newlyweds adjusting to married life, but something colder, heavier. A quiet war had already begun. Neither of us wanted this marriage. That much was clear. But I knew something Victor didn't. I knew what was coming. The betrayals. The bloodshed. The destruction that would fall upon him if he let his guard down again. I refused to let history repeat itself. But first I had to survive living with a husband who had no interest in acknowledging me. The carriage finally pulled up to the Lancaster estate, a separate residence from the grand family manor. Unlike the extravagant halls where we had taken our vows, this place was smaller, more secluded. It was obvious why they had sent Victor here. Out of sight. Out of mind. A servant hurried to open the carriage door, bowing deeply before Victor. Welcome home, sir. Victor didn't respond. Instead he shifted slightly, gripping the wheel of his chair, his movements precise and controlled. He was accustomed to people treating him as though he was fragile, but there was nothing weak about the way he carried himself. I stepped out behind him, my gaze drifting over the estate. It was beautiful in a quiet, understated way. High stone walls surrounded the property, shielding it from the outside world. The main house was built with dark wood and towering glass windows, a contrast of elegance and loneliness. This was not a place for a man who was meant to inherit power. This was a place for a man they wanted to forget. Victor rolled his chair forward, completely ignoring my presence. I followed without hesitation. The household staff lined up inside the grand entrance hall, their heads bowed in greeting. But as I looked closer, I noticed something. They weren't looking at Victor with respect. They were looking at him with pity. And when their eyes flickered to me, they were filled with disdain. I already knew what they were thinking. Another disposable wife. Another woman forced to marry the crippled son of the Lancaster family. She won't last long. Lady Lancaster, one of the older servants, finally spoke, her tone clipped and professional. Your room has been prepared. My room. Not our room. I glanced at Victor, wondering if he had been the one to arrange it. But he remained impassive, as if none of this concerned him. Of course. Victor had no intention of sharing a life with me, let alone a bedroom. I had expected it, but the finality of it settled deep in my bones. Understood, I said simply, keeping my expression unreadable. The servant raised an eyebrow, as if she had been hoping for a different reaction. Disappointment flickered in her gaze before she nodded and turned to lead the way. I followed her through the halls, my eyes tracing the intricate woodwork, the paintings that lined the walls. Everything was a stark reminder that this was not my home. It was Victor's prison. And now it was mine too. The next few days passed in a blur of formality and distance. Victor barely acknowledged my existence. He spent his days locked in his study, immersed in business dealings, while I wandered the halls, memorizing every corner of my new reality. I quickly learned that the household staff had little interest in serving me. Meals were placed on my table without a word. My clothes were prepared but never adjusted to my preferences. The servants whispered behind my back, thinking I wouldn't notice. I did. But I didn't let it affect me. Because I wasn't here to be liked. I was here to survive. On the fourth morning, I decided to venture into the study. It was a large, sunlit room lined with bookshelves, a desk positioned near the window where Victor sat, papers spread out before him. He didn't look up when I entered. "Do you need something?" His voice was flat, emotionless. I stepped closer, glancing at the documents in front of him. "I want to help." That made him pause. Finally, he lifted his gaze to meet mine, his sharp green eyes scanning my face like I was some puzzle he had no interest in solving. "Help," he echoed, unimpressed. "With your work," I clarified. "I know about business negotiations. I can." "No." The single word was cold. "Final." I exhaled slowly. "Why not?" Victor leaned back in his chair, studying me as if I had just said something absurd. "You're here because my family needed someone to fill Veronica's place," he said calmly. "That's all. You don't need to involve yourself in my affairs." I clenched my hands at my sides. "Your affairs affect me now, whether you like it or not." Something flickered in his expression. A hint of amusement? Annoyance? I couldn't tell. "You misunderstand," he said smoothly. "I don't expect you to be involved in anything. In fact, I prefer it that way." I held his gaze, refusing to back down. Victor Lancaster may have accepted his fate in my past life, but this time, I would not let him fade into the background. I turned on my heel and walked out without another word. If he wanted to pretend I didn't exist, so be it. For now. That evening, as I sat alone in the dining hall, the doors suddenly creaked open. I expected a servant, but instead it was Veronica. My sister stood there, her deep red gown hugging her perfect figure, her golden curls cascading over her shoulders. She had always been beautiful. Everyone said so. But in this moment she was more than just beautiful. She was smirking. "Oh, Celeste," she cooed, stepping inside as if she belonged here. "How does it feel?" I set down my fork. "How does what feel?" She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Being married to a man who can barely stand?" The words were meant to wound. They didn't. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers curling around the delicate stem of my wine glass. "It's funny," I mused, tilting my head. "You were supposed to be the one in this chair. If you were so repulsed by him, why did you cry so desperately to marry him last time?" Veronica's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. I smiled sweetly. He didn't know. He didn't remember. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I had something over her. Veronica's fingers twitched at her side before she forced a laugh. "Well, enjoy your time with him, dear sister," she said, flipping her golden hair over her shoulder. "You'll regret it soon enough." She turned to leave, but I wasn't done. "Oh, Veronica?" I called, making her pause. She turned, her brow arching in question. I raised my glass in a mock toast. "Be careful," I said lightly. "You might be the one with regrets." Veronica's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing as she left. I exhaled slowly, setting my glass down. One battle at a time. I had already survived this long. Now I just had to make Victor see that I wasn't his enemy. I was his only ally. The Lancaster estate was eerily quiet at night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every breath of wind that slipped through the cracks in the window felt like a whisper against my skin. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful, like the house itself was waiting for something to happen. Or maybe I was the one waiting. Victor and I had barely spoken since my encounter with Veronica. He still spent his days locked in his study, shutting me out as though I were nothing more than an inconvenience. If he wanted to act that way, fine. I had spent enough time trying to navigate this marriage alone. But I wasn't here to be ignored. I was here to change things. And that meant understanding the man I had married, whether he wanted me to or not. I threw off my covers and padded across the cold wooden floor, my bare feet barely making a sound. The house was still, but something felt off. I had lived here for weeks now, but the shadows tonight seemed heavier, thicker. It wasn't until I reached the hallway that I realized what was wrong. Victor's study door was open. That door was never open. He always locked it, making sure no one disturbed him. But tonight, a sliver of candlelight spilled into the hallway, flickering against the walls like a beacon calling me forward. I hesitated. This was not my concern. If Victor had forgotten to close the door, it wasn't my place to step in. but my feet moved before my mind could stop them. I pressed my fingers against the heavy wooden door and pushed it open just enough to see inside. Victor was there, sitting at his desk, but he wasn't working. His hands were clenched around a piece of paper, his jaw tight, his eyes stormy as they flickered over whatever he was reading. I had never seen him look so uncontrolled. Carefully I stepped inside. He didn't notice me. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. His fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the paper tighter, his breathing shallow. I had seen that look before. Not in this life but in the last. Pain. Not the physical kind. The kind that buried itself deep in the chest and never left. I took another step forward, my voice soft. Victor. His body stiffened. He didn't turn. For a long moment he just sat there, unmoving. Then slowly, deliberately he set the paper down and leaned back in his chair. You should be asleep. His voice was low, steady, but there was something underneath it, something brittle. I didn't look at the paper. I wanted to, but I knew if I did he would shut me out even more. I heard noise, I said instead. It wasn't a lie. Not really. Are you all right? A dry, humorless chuckle escaped his lips. That's an odd question coming from my wife. I ignored the bitterness in his tone. It's a normal question coming from anyone with basic human decency. He turned his head then, his sharp green eyes locking onto mine. The candlelight cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp edges of his features. There was something calculating in his expression, something guarded. Then just as quickly it was gone. I'm fine, he said smoothly. You can go back to bed. He wasn't fine. But I knew better than to push him when he had already decided to retreat. I nodded slightly, turning toward the door. But just as I reached the threshold, his voice stopped me. Celeste. I turned back, surprised he had used my name. His fingers tapped against the desk, his gaze unreadable. For a moment it looked like he wanted to say something. Ask something. But then he simply exhaled and looked away. Never mind. The moment was gone. I didn't press. Not yet. I simply walked away, leaving him alone with his ghosts. But I knew one thing for certain. Victor Lancaster had secrets. And I was going to uncover them. The sun barely peeked over the horizon when I left my room. The house was still draped in shadows, the servants just beginning to stir. Normally I wouldn't be up this early, but I had barely slept after what had happened last night. Victor was hiding something. That much was obvious. The way he clutched that letter, the way his entire body stiffened at my presence. It wasn't just anger or annoyance. It was pain. And pain always had a source. If I wanted to change our future, I needed to understand his past. But I couldn't do it alone. I had no allies in this house. The staff either ignored me or watched me like a hawk, waiting for me to fail. Victor barely acknowledged me, and Veronica, well, she was the last person I could trust. But there was one person who knew more about this family than anyone else. And if I played my cards right, she might be willing to talk. Lady Beatrice Lancaster. Victor's grandmother. She had not attended our wedding. That alone spoke volumes. Among the Lancaster family she was an anomaly, feared, respected, yet rarely involved in their public affairs. Some claimed she had distanced herself from the family's power struggles. Others whispered that she simply waited, watching, pulling strings from the shadows. What I knew for certain was this. If there was anyone who could tell me the truth about Victor's past, it was her. And today I was going to meet her. The estate had a secondary wing where Lady Beatrice resided. Unlike the rest of the house, which felt cold and suffocating, this area was different. The halls smelled faintly of lavender, and the tapestries were older, untouched by the modern renovations that had swept through the rest of the estate. A maid stood outside her door, clearly surprised to see me. Lady Lancaster, she greeted, her tone hesitant. I'd like to speak with Lady Beatrice. The maid's lips pressed together. Her ladyship does not take visitors without appointment. I smiled. Then let's pretend I made one. The maid hesitated, then sighed and disappeared behind the heavy oak doors. A minute later she reappeared, gesturing for me to enter. Lady Beatrice sat in a grand armchair near the window, her long silver hair falling in soft waves down her back. Though she was old, there was nothing frail about her. Her posture was regal, her deep-set eyes sharp as they studied me. You are braver than I expected, she said, voice smooth as silk. I didn't let my expression falter. I only wished to speak with you. She gestured for me to sit. I obeyed. For a moment neither of us spoke. She merely observed me as though trying to peel away every layer of my soul with a single glance. "You remind me of someone," she finally said. I tilted my head. "Who?" Her lips curved slightly. "Someone who understood that survival in this family requires more than obedience." I didn't need her to explain further. He was talking about herself. Good. That meant she already knew I wasn't some naive girl who had married into this family without understanding the stakes. "I want to know the truth about Victor," I said. "His past. The things this family has done to him." Her eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "Why?" I met her gaze without hesitation. "Because I refuse to let history repeat itself." Silence. Then slowly Lady Beatrice leaned forward. "Then listen carefully, child," she said softly. "And I will tell you how this family has already doomed him." Lady Beatrice's gaze pinned me in place, her expression unreadable. I expected hesitation, a test to see if I was worthy of knowing Victor's past. But instead she studied me with something else. Amusement, perhaps. Or curiosity. "You are an interesting woman, Celeste," she finally said, her voice as smooth as aged wine. "Most brides in your position either cower or flee. Yet here you are demanding the truth." "I have no intention of running." Her lips twitched in approval. "Good." She reached for a delicate teacup on the table beside her and took a measured sip. "The Lancaster family has always been ruthless," she began. "Power is not inherited here. It is taken. But Victor, he was never meant to survive this world." My fingers curled against my lap. "What do you mean?" A sigh escaped her, heavy with age and memory. "His mother, Evelyn, was never supposed to bear a Lancaster heir." I stiffened. The way she spoke, there was something wrong in the way she phrased it. "She was an outsider," Beatrice continued, setting down her teacup. "Beautiful, yes. Intelligent, perhaps. But weak. And weak women do not last long in this family. My son, Reginald, married her against my better judgment. He thought she could handle it. He thought love was enough to shield her." The way she said love made it sound like a foolish dream, something insignificant in the face of power. She did not last. A cold chill ran down my spine. What happened to her? Beatrice's eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw something strange in them. Pity. "She died," she said simply. "Victor was only 6. My breath hitched. I had expected something cruel. I had expected abuse, mistreatment, something along those lines. But this was worse. She was found in her chambers, hanging from the ceiling with a silk scarf," Beatrice continued, her voice devoid of emotion. "Some say she killed herself. Others believe she was helped." The words slammed into my chest like a physical blow. "Helped. Murdered." I swallowed hard. "And Victor?" "He was there." The air in the room turned suffocating. "He saw her," Beatrice said, watching me closely. "They found him in the room with her body, silent, unmoving. Just standing there." I pressed a hand against my stomach, nausea curling in my gut. That was why his eyes were so cold. Why he always carried himself like a man with nothing left to lose. He had already lost everything. "The official story was suicide," Beatrice continued. "Reginald barely fought the rumors. Perhaps he knew it was true. Perhaps he knew the truth was much darker. Either way, he remarried within the year. Of course he did. That's how these families worked, wasn't it? Wives were replaceable. Love was an inconvenience. And the scars left behind were ignored, buried beneath silk and diamonds." "His stepmother?" I asked. Beatrice's lips curled in distaste. "Veronica's mother. And that woman, she made sure Victor understood exactly where he stood in this family." I didn't need her to spell it out. I could already see it. A grieving child alone in a house full of wolves. A boy raised not with love, but with the understanding that he was unwanted. That he was nothing more than a mistake. My nails dug into my palm. He must have hated them. He must have despised everything they represented. And yet he still played their game. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice quieter than before. Beatrice regarded me for a long moment. "Because you asked," she said simply. Then after a pause she added, "And because I am curious to see if you will break him further, or if you will be the first to stop him from breaking entirely." I wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged in my throat. She smiled as though she had already won some silent battle. "Be careful, child," she murmured, leaning back in her chair. "A man who has lost everything does not fear losing more. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous of all." The conversation was over. I stood, my limbs heavy, my mind even heavier. I knew Victor was complicated. I knew he had secrets. But I had never imagined they would be this dark. And as I walked back through the quiet halls of the estate, one thought echoed over and over in my mind. What would a man like Victor do if he ever thought he had something worth keeping again? The house felt different after my conversation with Lady Beatrice. Or maybe I was different. I saw the walls of the estate for what they truly were now. Cages, carefully constructed to keep secrets buried and wounds hidden. The grand chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the luxurious silence. All of it masked the rot that had seeped into the Lancaster family for generations. Victor wasn't just cold. He wasn't just distant. He was a man raised in darkness. A man who had learned that love was nothing but a tool used to hurt. And yet I couldn't walk away. I had made my choice the moment I agreed to this marriage. But knowing his past changed everything. That night, as I sat at the dining table across from him, I couldn't stop looking at his hands. Long fingers, calloused knuckles, the faint scar across his index finger. He held his fork with perfect precision, his movements effortless, controlled. But now I saw the tension in them. The way his grip was always just a little too firm, like he was bracing for something. "You're staring." His voice cut through the silence, smooth as always, but I could hear the edge beneath it. I didn't look away. "Am I?" He lifted his gaze slowly, his green eyes sharp as they studied me. Normally I would have looked away by now. Normally I would have let him win this silent battle. But I was done pretending that I didn't care. "I spoke with your grandmother today," I said, keeping my tone even. Something flickered in his expression, gone in an instant. "Did you?" he said, taking a slow sip of wine. "And what wise words did she bestow upon you?" "She told me about your mother." I expected him to tense, to lash out. But instead he merely set his glass down and leaned back in his chair. "She would," he murmured. That was it. No anger. No denial. Just an exhale of acceptance, as though he had long since stopped fighting that particular ghost. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "For what happened to her?" He scoffed. "Spare me your pity." "It's not pity." He stilled. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I understand now." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then to my surprise he laughed. Not loudly. Not joyfully. Just a quiet, bitter chuckle as he ran a hand through his dark hair. "You understand?" he echoed, shaking his head. "Tell me, Celeste, what exactly do you think you understand?" I held my ground. "Why you keep everyone at arm's length." He didn't respond. "Why you act like you don't care. Why you push me away before I even have a chance to be close." Still he said nothing. "But you do care," I continued. "That's the part you hate the most, isn't it?" His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists against the table. "That's enough." His voice was low, dangerous. I should have stopped. But I was tired of being careful. "I'm not leaving," I said. "No matter how much you try to make me." His eyes darkened, his fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to grip the edge of the table. "Don't test me, Celeste." I leaned forward, meeting his glare head-on. "And what will you do? Lock me away? Ignore me for the rest of our lives?" Something cracked in his expression. Something raw. "I could," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you won't," I said. He looked at me, then really looked at me. And for the first time I saw it, hesitation. A single, fleeting moment of weakness in the fortress he had built around himself. Then just as quickly it was gone. Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This conversation is over." I didn't try to stop him. I simply watched as he strode out of the dining hall, his shoulders tense, his breath unsteady. I had pushed him. And for the first time since our marriage began, I had won. Victor avoided me for 3 days. It wasn't unexpected. I had seen the way his body tensed, how his eyes had darkened with something dangerously close to emotion that night at dinner. I had pushed him too far too fast. But I didn't regret it. Because for the first time I had seen something real beneath the cold, controlled mask he wore so well. And now I was going to push again. On the 4th morning I found him in the study. The doors were slightly open, the scent of aged books and whiskey drifting into the hallway. I stepped inside quietly, half expecting him to order me out the second he saw me. But he didn't even look up. He was sitting behind the large mahogany desk, his fingers resting against his temple, eyes scanning a document in front of him. His jacket was draped over the chair, his tie loosened just enough to suggest he had been here for hours. I took a slow breath. "You've been avoiding me." His pen didn't pause. "You overestimate your importance." "Why? A weak one at that." I stepped closer, my heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. "And yet here you are, drowning yourself in work instead of facing me." He let out a quiet exhale, setting the pen down. "What do you want, Celeste?" I walked to the chair across from his desk and sat, crossing my legs. "A truce." That caught his attention. His gaze lifted, sharp and assessing. "A truce." I nodded. "You don't want this marriage." "Neither do I." His lips twitched as if amused by my honesty. "But," I continued, "we are stuck with each other." He leaned back slightly, studying me with that unreadable expression I was beginning to recognize as his default. "And what exactly are the terms of this truce?" I met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "No more hostility. No more cold shoulders. We don't have to pretend to love each other, but we can at least try to be civil." His fingers tapped against the desk. "Civil," he repeated. "Yes." He tilted his head slightly. "And why should I agree to this?" I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "Because, Victor, we are married. And whether we like it or not, our futures are now tied together. So instead of making each other miserable, we might as well figure out how to coexist without wanting to kill each other." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied me, really studied me, like he was trying to solve some puzzle he hadn't realized was complicated. Then finally he sighed. "A truce then," he murmured. "For now." I didn't miss the way his voice dipped on those last two words. A warning. A promise. Still, it was something. I pushed a little further. "And as part of that truce, I want to know more about the company." His brow arched. "The company?" "Yes." I straightened. "I want to understand what I've married into." He studied me for another long moment before leaning forward, his hands clasped together. "Do you have any business experience, Celeste?" I lifted my chin. "Not much. But I learn fast." He smirked. "Do you?" "Yes." He tapped his fingers once more, then nodded. "Fine. If you want to understand the company, I'll arrange for you to shadow some meetings. You can listen. Observe. A small victory." "Good," I said. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "You're persistent." "I've been told that before." Something flickered in his expression. Amusement, perhaps. But he didn't let it linger. Instead, he stood, rolling his shoulders. "If we are to have this truce," he said slowly, "I expect the same from you." I frowned. "The same." He turned to face me fully. "Honesty. No games." I met his gaze. "I'm not the one playing games, Victor." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but he didn't respond. Instead, he nodded once and walked toward the door, leaving me sitting there in his study. It wasn't much. But it was the start of something. And for now, that was enough. The so-called truce changed everything. Not in the obvious ways. Not in the way a marriage normally should. But in the small, nearly imperceptible moments between Victor and me. Before, our interactions had been limited to tense silences and clipped exchanges, carefully measured like two opponents in a war neither of us wanted to fight but refused to lose. Now there was something different. Not warmth. Not yet. But something else. A shift. A recognition that we had both agreed, however reluctantly, to stop tearing each other apart. I first noticed it in the way Victor no longer ignored me when we passed each other in the halls. He still wasn't one for unnecessary words. But instead of looking past me as if I were a ghost, he met my gaze, acknowledged me. That alone was enough to make the air between us feel heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite name. Then there were the dinners. We still ate together in silence most nights, but it was different now. He no longer spent the entire time absorbed in his phone or a business document. He watched me. Not in an intrusive way. Not in a way that suggested he wanted to speak. But I felt his gaze lingering on me between bites, as if he were studying me in a way he hadn't before. And then there were the meetings. True to his word, Victor had arranged for me to shadow him, starting with a small executive briefing. It was nothing more than a discussion of market trends and investment strategies, but I quickly realized that sitting in a room with Victor in his element was nothing like speaking to him at home. There he was silent. Here he owned the room. Every executive listened when he spoke, hanging on to his every word, nodding in agreement before he even finished his sentences. He was sharp, commanding. Every move calculated. It was fascinating to watch. And for the first time I understood just how powerful he truly was. After the meeting, as we walked back to the car, I finally spoke. "You're different in there." Victor glanced at me, arching a brow. "Different?" I nodded. "At home you act like nothing matters. But in there, you care. You control everything." He exhaled, adjusting his cufflinks. "Business requires control. So does life." He didn't respond immediately, but I caught the way his fingers flexed slightly. "You think I don't care about anything?" he asked finally. I hesitated. "I think you pretend not to," I said. "Because it's easier." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You really do overestimate your importance, Celeste." I ignored the insult. "Then tell me, what do you care about?" Victor didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window of the car as the city blurred past us. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Pi Company," he said. "Pi Legacy." And then, after a long pause, he added, almost as an afterthought, almost as if it surprised even him. "And perhaps my wife." My breath caught. I turned to him, expecting to see mockery in his expression, but there was none. Just a quiet, unreadable look in his eyes. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. Victor turned away, returning his attention to his phone, as if he hadn't just said something that shifted the air between us entirely. But I felt it. I knew he felt it too. Because for the first time since this marriage began, Victor Lancaster had acknowledged me as something more than just a pawn. And I wasn't sure if that made things better, or infinitely more complicated. Something changed after that conversation in the car. Victor didn't speak of it again, didn't acknowledge the shift between us, but I felt it. I saw it in the way his gaze lingered on me just a second too long, in the way his voice softened ever so slightly when he spoke my name. It was a slow unraveling. Not intentional, not planned, but inevitable. Like two planets caught in the same gravitational pull, unable to escape each other's orbit. The first time it happened, I told myself it was nothing. I had been working late in the study, going over notes from the meetings I'd been attending with Victor. I wasn't expected to understand everything. Not yet, but I was determined to learn. Hours passed. My back ached. My head pounded. I didn't even realize how late it had gotten until the clock struck 1. And then Victor walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with that unreadable expression. "You're still up." I stifled a yawn. I wanted to finish this. He stepped closer, glancing at the papers spread across the desk. "You don't need to push yourself so hard. No one expects you to become an expert overnight." I glanced up at him. "I expect it." Something flickered in his expression, something almost resembling approval. He reached past me, plucking a paper from the pile. "This report is outdated," he murmured, tossing it aside. "You should focus on the quarterly projections instead." I frowned, rubbing my temple. "I can barely make sense of them." Victor's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. "That's because you're trying to read them like a student. You need to read them like a strategist." I blinked. "And how exactly does a strategist read financial projections?" He pulled out the chair beside me and sat down, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I expected him to push the papers back toward me, to offer a brief explanation before dismissing me. Instead, he reached for a pen and began underlining sections, explaining them in a way I actually understood. I had never seen him like this. Patient. Kind of. His usual cold detachment was gone, replaced by something calmer, something steadier. I barely realized how close we were until I turned my head and found myself inches away from him. My breath hitched. Victor stilled. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, we weren't husband and wife forced into a marriage of convenience. We were simply two people caught in a moment too intimate to ignore. I should have pulled away. I should have broken the spell before it became something neither of us could take back. But then his gaze dropped to my lips. and the air between us became impossibly heavy. Victor was the one to move first, so subtly that I wasn't sure if I imagined it. His fingers brushed against mine just barely, but the touch sent a shiver through me. I exhaled shakily. He noticed. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. Victor leaned back, clearing his throat. "That's enough for tonight," he said, voice controlled once more. I nodded, my pulse still unsteady. "Right. Of course." He stood, hesitating for half a second before turning toward the door. Just before he left, he glanced over his shoulder. "Get some sleep, Celeste." And then he was gone. I sat there long after he left, staring at the empty space beside me, my heart racing for reasons I wasn't ready to admit. I had wanted distance. I had wanted control. But the lines between us were blurring, and I had no idea how to stop it. I told myself it was a one-time thing, that the moment in the study had been nothing more than an accident, an illusion created by exhaustion and proximity. But I was lying to myself, because it kept happening. Small, fleeting moments that meant nothing and everything at once. The way Victor's fingers would brush against mine when he handed me something. The way he would hesitate just a second too long before pulling away. The way his gaze would find me across a crowded room, lingering in a way that made my stomach tighten. It was dangerous, because the more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. And I knew that I couldn't afford to fall into whatever this was becoming. But it was already too late. I realized it one evening at a gala. Victor had insisted I attend with him, something I wasn't sure was for appearances or something else entirely. Either way, I agreed, slipping into the role of the perfect wife as we entered the grand ballroom. It was one of those events where everyone wore masks. Not literal ones, but the kind that came with power and influence. Smiles were painted on, pleasantries exchanged, but every word was laced with hidden meaning. Victor fit in effortlessly. He moved through the crowd with the kind of confidence that made people step aside, the kind of power that made even the most seasoned businessmen lower their voices when they spoke to him. I followed his lead, listening, observing. And then I felt it. A hand on my lower back. Light. Barely there. Victor. His touch sent a jolt through me, but I didn't pull away. Neither did he. It wasn't necessary. There was no reason for him to be touching me. No reason for his fingers to rest just there at the base of my spine, warm through the thin fabric of my dress. But he didn't move. And neither did I. It was nothing. A simple gesture easily explained away. But then a man approached. An older gentleman, someone from another firm. His gaze flickered to me, lingering in a way that made my stomach turn. Victor must have noticed, because his fingers pressed slightly into my back. Not possessive. Not obvious. Just there. A silent message. I had no idea what changed in that moment. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But for the rest of the night, Victor never strayed far. And I pretended not to notice the way I leaned into him without meaning to, the way I let his presence steady me in a way that no one ever had before. When we finally returned home, the air between us felt different. I had spent the entire car ride staring out the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. That I wasn't falling into something I couldn't control. By the time we stepped inside, I was ready to escape to my room, to put as much distance between us as possible. But Victor had other plans. Celeste. His voice stopped me. I turned, pulse unsteady. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, he said, "You looked beautiful tonight." I couldn't breathe. Victor Lancaster didn't give compliments. Not meaningless ones. Not at all. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to push. But I didn't. Because I knew deep down that we were already at the edge of something we couldn't take back. So instead I whispered, "Good night, Victor." And then, before I could do something reckless, before I could let myself believe that this was real, I turned and walked away. I should have known it wouldn't last. The fragile thing forming between Victor and me, whatever it was always bound to break. And when it did, it shattered completely. Started with a business trip. Victor had been traveling more lately, his schedule growing busier with each passing week. I had become accustomed to his absence, to the empty space beside me at the dinner table, to the quiet of the house without him in it. But this time was different. This time I felt his absence like an ache I didn't want to name. Because I had started waiting for him. Not in the way a wife should wait for her husband. Not out of duty or obligation. but because I missed him. I hated myself for it. And when he returned, late at night, looking exhausted but still put together in that effortless way of his, I told myself I wouldn't let it show. But then I saw her. The woman. She was walking just a step behind him as they entered the house, an unfamiliar figure in an elegant black dress. She was beautiful in the way that women who exist in Victor's world tend to be, refined, effortless, completely untouchable. And she was laughing. Something he had said. Something inside me tightened. Victor barely glanced at me as he stepped inside. "Celeste, this is Evelyn Clark," he said, his voice unreadable. "She's a potential investor." I didn't move. Evelyn studied me with polite interest, offering her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Victor speaks highly of you." My fingers curled at my sides. I didn't know why I was so angry. I had no right to be. Victor and I weren't real. But in that moment, watching them together, I realized something terrifying. Somewhere along the way I had wanted us to be. I didn't take her hand. Instead I turned to Victor, my voice controlled, steady. "It's late." He met my gaze, something flickering in his expression. "We had business to discuss." "Right?" I said, smiling tightly. "Of course. Business." Evelyn's eyes darted between us, and for a brief second, I wondered if she saw through the mask I was so desperately trying to keep in place. "I should go," she said smoothly. "It was lovely meeting you, Celeste." I didn't respond. Victor walked her to the door. Said something in a low voice. I didn't stay to hear what it was. I turned on my heel and walked upstairs, my pulse pounding. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. Because for the first time since this marriage began, I wanted to be the one standing beside Victor. And I hated myself for it. I was still awake when he came upstairs. I was sitting at the edge of my bed, my fingers clenched into fists, trying to will away the mess of emotions tangled inside me. I felt him before I saw him. He stood in the doorway, silent. Watching. "Are you angry?" His voice was quiet, measured. I let out a slow breath. "No. You're lying." I lifted my gaze to his. "Does it matter?" A muscle in his jaw tightened. And then, before I could stop myself, I asked the question burning inside me. "Was she with you the whole time?" Victor didn't flinch. Didn't look away. But he didn't answer either. Something in my chest cracked. I stood up, shaking my head. "Of course." His eyes darkened. "Celeste." "It's fine," I cut him off. This was never real anyway. Silence. A tense, unbearable silence that stretched between us like an open wound. Then finally Victor exhaled. "You think I would betray you?" The words were quiet, controlled. But there was something dangerous beneath them. I swallowed. "It doesn't matter what I think." He stepped closer. "It does to me." I should have left. I should have walked away before this conversation turned into something neither of us could undo. But I couldn't move. I was too busy drowning in the way he was looking at me. Like he was furious. Like he was hurt. Like he wanted to pull me closer instead of push me away. "You don't trust me," he murmured. I wanted to laugh. "I don't even know what we are, Victor. How can I trust something that doesn't exist?" He was close now. So close I could feel his breath against my skin. "This doesn't exist?" he asked, his voice rough. And then, before I could respond, before I could stop myself, Victor kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was a collision. A breaking point. Months of tension, of unsaid words, of emotions we had both tried to ignore. All of it poured into that single desperate moment. I didn't stop him. I couldn't stop him. Because for all my denial, all my restraint, I had been waiting for this. And now that it was happening, I didn't know how to let go. I should have pulled away. The moment Victor's lips touched mine, I should have stopped him. But I didn't. Because for the first time since this marriage began, I stopped pretending. I stopped fighting the pull, the unbearable tension, the way my heart raced whenever he was near. I let myself sink into him, into the way his hands framed my face, into the way he kissed me like he was unraveling, like he had been holding back just as much as I had. I didn't know who broke first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. All I knew was that one second we were standing in the middle of my bedroom, and the next I was pressed against the wall, his body flush against mine, his grip possessive, demanding. And I let him. I let myself forget. About our arrangement, about the secrets, about the fact that I had spent months convincing myself I felt nothing for this man. Because none of it mattered. Not when he kissed me like this. Not when his hands traced the shape of me like he had been waiting to do it for a lifetime. I felt his hesitation. The way he tensed for a brief moment like he was giving me a chance to push him away. But I didn't. Instead I reached for him. Pulled him closer. Let him know without words that I didn't want him to stop. That was all it took. A soft curse left his lips before his mouth found mine again, harder this time. Like he was breaking apart, like we were both shattering in each other's arms. It was intoxicating. Terrifying. Because for all my control, for all my carefully constructed walls, I was powerless against him. And I knew deep down that this wasn't just desire. It wasn't just an accident. I wanted him. Not as my business partner. Not as my husband by contract. I wanted him as mine. But reality has a way of forcing itself back in no matter how badly we try to ignore it. The sound of my phone ringing shattered the moment. Victor pulled back slightly, breathing hard. His forehead rested against mine, his hands still framing my face